I think it's important that people don't make that mistake of, assuming that people don't know, because then when you encounter someone that's deep into a conspiracy theory, they'll be able to completely swamp you with information that you won't be able to, you won't be aware of, or you won't be able to counteract. So you have to be aware that simply knowing loads of details doesn't actually make you better informed, or, to have done proper research on a topic.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm super thrilled to be bringing you Dr. Chris Kavanagh. And Dr. Chris Kavanagh is an Oxford-trained cognitive and evolutionary anthropologist who's currently in Japan. He's also one half of the Decoding the Gurus podcast, which is an amazing podcast. I highly recommend it, where they take about a fair and balanced approach to taking a look at some of the gurus out there who are telling us what to do, and guiding us sometimes quite poorly through the maze of complexities of decision making day to day, or actually simplifying that quite a bit. And I'm looking forward to going through the Gurometer, the highly scientific method that you guys have determined for passing judgment on whether someone's a guru. But first, how are you doing, Chris? And where are you?
Yeah, I'm currently based in Tokyo and doing as well as possible on a Monday morning. But I've been based in Japan for about 7 or 8 years now. I came over to do research for my PhD, and I basically didn't go back. So I'm based permanently here. I work at a Japanese university in Tokyo, but I have a dual appointment at Oxford as a researcher. So yeah, it's a winding road, and my accent, as you might know, I have one because I'm originally from Northern Ireland. So that's this is not a Japanese nor a Oxford accent. Yeah.
So what did you do your PhD on? What brought you to Japan?
So cognitive anthropology. I started out more in the arts and humanities study of religion side of things, and then I slowly migrated towards more quantitative empirical side of anthropology, which does exist. People may not know about it, but we're still holding on there. And so I did a second master's in cognitive and evolutionary anthropology, and then a DPhil in anthropology at Oxford, and I was focusing on rituals, collective rituals. So Japan is a interesting country in that regard, and culture, because they're one of the relatively rare cases where you have a large amount of ritual activity, including festivals, as well as rituals involving like the household and ancestors and whatnot, but very low levels of overt religious belief or affiliations. So if you're interested in ritual psychology, it's kind of a good place for that, because you can look at the effects of ritual and kind of disentangle the belief aspect.
Okay. I totally want to get into the guru stuff, but this is fascinating. So how does a culture, not lose religion, but not be focused on religion while maintaining a heavy emphasis on ritual? Does the ritual replace it? I mean, you're absolutely right. Most people think of one going with the other. I don't know, the calendar of the Catholic Church determining all the rituals that happen on the north side of the Mediterranean.
Yes. So you get into this interesting scenario when you study rituals, that you start to see them everywhere, right? Like it's kind of trite to point out that, shaking hands or bowing are culturally prescribed rituals for greeting, but it's true. And you start to notice that, outside of religious contexts, in, for example, inauguration events. So people might see that as just a celebration event. But as we saw with Obama, when he made a misstatement during the Pledge of Allegiance, then he needed to do it again, right, the next day or a couple of days later and record it. It was very important because the legitimacy of handing over power and having ceremonies that indicate that's taking place is still really important, and became more important when certain leaders didn't feel inclined to agree with the peaceful handing over of power. So you see rituals in all sorts of contexts, but in the case of Japan and maybe East Asia more broadly, this disconnecting away from the issue of belief being given primacy in religious or cultural contexts is, I think, due to a thing that anthropologists or study religion scholars talk about, orthopraxic religion, which is actually pretty common around certain parts in the world.
I don't know what orthopraxic religion is. What is that?
So orthopraxic is put up in comparison to orthodoxic, like the religions focused on belief, which would be your Abrahamic monotheistic religions, right? It matters what you believe in and which God you're praying to and whatnot. Orthopraxic religions are more focused on what you do. What matters less is what creed that you ascribe to, and more whether you perform a ritual practice the way that you're supposed to, or whether you adhere to customs. And a lot of the religious systems in East and Central Asia follow this kind of system that, yes, there is belief and kind of complex theological doctrines, but for the majority of people that might be, considered within a religious system, those aren't given priority. What's given priority is performing rituals correctly, doing things on the right day, and so on. So Japan falls, I've argued in a paper and other places, firmly in that tradition. And when you have that, it's not really that hard to see why you can have lack of, distinct affiliation or overt religious belief. And then also there's the fact that in Japan, the religious system is largely non-exclusive and syncretic. So people can, go to a Shinto shrine when their children are born for blessings, get married in a Christian ceremony, and when they die, they'll have a Buddhist funeral, and nobody will bat an eyelid at that. So that's not the same as in Northern Ireland or America, I think, generally speaking.
Yeah, just to pick a place that's been a hotbed of, what you believe being important. So I'm right away thinking about, the Roman emperors wanting everyone, you can worship whoever you want, but you need to make sacrifices to the Roman emperor. You need to treat him as a god. We don't really care if you believe, you just have to go through the rituals and, I don't know, sacrifice a chicken or a goat or whatever it was that they had to sacrifice. And the Christians and the Jews having a major issue with that in ancient Rome.
Yeah, and I think, there's lots of, well, not lots of, but there's growing research on the roles that rituals play, or especially collective rituals. So within a Brazilian jiu-jitsu context, I know there's some controversies around it, but the belt whipping gauntlets are an example of a collective dysphoric ritual, or maybe a hazing ritual in terms of the broad category. And you can look at those and look at the potential effects that it has on individuals or groups to participate in them without being that concerned if it happens to be a Christian ceremony or snake handling event or whatever. The theological justification for it is often, at least for me, not as interesting as what taking parts in those events do to you cognitively speaking or psychologically speaking. And I was raised an Irish Catholic. I don't believe in Catholicism, but taking part in masses, for 18 years and reciting things in school, it leaves a imprint, and the people talk about Catholic guilt, and I think these kind of things are true. They're like bodily true from rituals, and the theological things also have an impact. So yeah, I apologize for going on about this, but it's my like academic area of interest.
Yeah. Oh, you brought up jiu-jitsu, and I know you've trained. How long did you train for?
Probably in total about 8 years or so.
So more than enough to be familiar with the culture. I've argued that jiu-jitsu kind of fills a rite of passage or a ritual of passage role, in that it's different. There aren't very many things in society now that are difficult, where there's a chance of failure, where there's pain, and where there's recognition at the end and bonding to your peer group. And mostly, I guess, historically, you'd be bonding with a group of men. So I'm not going to get into the gender aspects of it, but it really takes the place of, I don't know, the Spartans kicking out their youth to go live on the land, or a native kid going to do a vision quest, or sailors getting, some kind of horrendous beating as they cross the equator for the first time. Those don't exist. And to some extent, training in jiu-jitsu and participating in the rituals of jiu-jitsu it fills a little bit of that niche as a rite of passage, as a way to, I'm not a huge advocate for the men's movement, but I think it fits in that niche quite nicely.
Yeah, I think in modern secular environments, Jordan Peterson and whatnot are popular for a reason. There is a loss
because people miss their grandfather. People miss simple answers from their grandfather.
Yeah, and martial arts clubs in general, I think, are one of the maybe overlooked in like the research literature as well. These groups that can provide very intense bonds and very strong senses of identity, and also, like you say, a kind of arduous physical training, right, that you perform with other people. And maybe the only other times in history where that was the norm would have been in like mystery cults or in military settings. So I think that they definitely can, like modern martial arts system, provide a deep sense of identity and group belonging to people. And with that, you have to learn a new terminology. You have to learn a whole, like you say, a set of rituals, right? Like with BJJ, it's kind of a fusion of Brazilian culture and Japanese culture, like mixed together. And if you do judo, you tend to get a more formal indoctrination of the traditional Japanese hierarchical system and that. So yeah, it's I think martial arts are a fascinating subject to look at from the an anthropological or psychological point of view. It's a rich area that has not been tapped that much. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to pivot here into the guru stuff, because as I watch many of the gurus in society, especially nowadays in kind of the self-help space and in the health space and in the, intellectual dark web space, there's quite a few parallels to what I see in some jiu-jitsu or in some martial arts environments. And really, I see some cultic elements within all of those. But can we first start by defining what you mean by guru?
Yeah, and I will say there's also an obvious crossover that a whole bunch of the figures in the spheres you mentioned have demonstrated an interest in, especially Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? Like Russel Brand, Sam Harris, Anthony Robbins, I think, or Tony Robbins. Yeah,
probably.
Did
he do Taekwondo?
Wouldn't be a surprise.
I thought
maybe he did. Again, Joe Rogan,
What's part of the man cred as well, right? I mean, it's fascinating, but it does establish legitimacy as an alpha male, and that's something that I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm pontificating, but
no, I think you're spot on. That's a feature of it. And so in terms of like what's meant by a guru, So in some sense, people take that as a disparaging term, and I think that's relatively fair because it's, in most cases, it is used as a term of disparagement. But we also talk about, stats gurus or maths gurus, or so it doesn't necessarily have negative connotations. But the traditional usage of the term referenced usually figures claiming access to spiritual or religious special knowledge. And so you had figures who were active in religious or even, in cult settings. And similarly, people teaching about alternative medicine or Eastern systems of cultivation, or
anything but
systems.
here systems of cultivation.
Exactly.
The ancient Icelandic runes system of self-cultivation.
That's right. So maybe it can be here, but it has to be like from ancient times. That's the important thing. Like nobody wants the thing that was just invented by Birdie down the road 10 years ago. But when we are using it, we actually intended originally to look at the emergence of this group that we were referring to as secular gurus, mostly in the online sphere, who kind of eschewed that reference to traditional religious or spiritual insight and more presented themselves as kind of public intellectuals or cultural commentators. And if they do make reference to religion or spirituality, it's often in a very psychologized or metaphorical way. Like Jordan Peterson definitely talks about religion a lot, but in many respects, he presents that as a kind of extension of his psychology insight, right? So, or maybe vice versa. He's sort of an exception because of the amount that he's interested in religion. But we were noticing that there were characteristics amongst this emerging group that seemed to fit with some of the older models and in other ways be quite distinctive. So that was when we started looking at secular gurus. And we've since on the podcast, because we've covered a quite disparate group of people, tried to come up with a somewhat quantified system to characterize how much people fit in that framework.
Well, I think it's a great checklist for, to me, when I look at that list, which we're going to get into here, it's essentially a set of red or yellow flags that if you, any one of them, any two of them, okay, now we're really getting serious. 3 or more, like, holy shit, watch out. And I'm glad you specified your definition of guru. I mean, you're right. We do use it in a non-pejorative, non-religious. I mean, in my fire department, I'm often referred to as the hazmat guru, but I promise I am not not monetizing that adequately, not in any way, shape, or form.
You're religiously devoted to hazmat ideology and
yes,
sharing it with whoever will listen.
Okay.
Yeah. So I will say that we very recently looked at someone who more fit the kind of traditional guru characteristic, a Jesuit spiritual teacher called Anthony de Mello. And when we scored him on the Gurometer, which we'll talk about, he scored very lowly. So I think our Gurometer is, like you say, it's more focused on this current crop of gurus and maybe the more negative side of that sphere. So yeah, if you're scoring highly in our characteristics, it's generally not a good thing.
Okay. Well, why don't we start with our checklist or our scoring system? And by our, I mean yours and Matt's scoring system. So the number 1 is Galaxy-brainness. I think that's a proper word.
Yes,
and
it
what does that mean? Galaxy-brainness.
Yeah. So just to give credit, Mathew Browne is the Australian psychologist I worked with, and we worked decided on these terms together. And we do have the intention to, it actually started out as an academic paper and we were identifying these characteristics and then we repurposed it for the podcast. But we do intend, maybe with slightly different labels, to try and publish it. So, but Galaxy-brainness refers to, it's almost representative of the mean, of the exploding brain. And it's the tendency for individuals to express confident opinions across a kind of constellation of topics, that they don't focus on one specific area of expertise, like maybe they're a mathematician or a physicist, but they're talking about the selection process for the Supreme Court and virology and, advice for life. So they range across a whole constellation of topics and with a level of confidence which is often not warranted. So yeah,
that's a very polite way of saying it.
Yeah. So it's kind of we have polymaths. They do exist, but we have a lot more people that think that they are polymaths than actually are or should be respected across multiple topics.
I don't know how I used to enjoy listening to Jordan Peterson. I'll make that confession. And I became one of the things that began to turn me away from it. And here I'm going alienating another 30% of my audience. And in the last year, having alienated 50%, that's going to leave me with 20%. But here's what turned me off. It was like somebody would ask him, Dr. Peterson, what about, I don't know, spousal abuse? Well, it's very, very simple. It boils down to the story of, I don't know, Jonah and the whale symbolizes this, and the 3 days in the belly of the whale symbolize that. And here's the answer to spousal abuse. Okay, that's interesting. What about genocide? Oh, well, that's very, very simple. That ties in with the story of Cain and Abel and porridge, and the porridge symbolizes this. And there was never, and it's not 100% true, but there was never not an answer. And it'd be strange to be an expert in psychology and religion and the field of research around spousal abuse and the research around addiction and the research around genocide. I'm sure you could spend an entire academic career researching one aspect of the Armenian genocide in 1 year, like 1 year of the Armenian genocide in one region of Armenia, and you'd still wouldn't be at the bottom of that. And now to be an expert in all things human, that's a pretty amazing feat, really. So I don't know. That's my rant. Is that a bad example of Galaxy-brainness, or do you have better examples?
No, Jordan Peterson is a good example because he is willing to speak on a wide range of topics. But I think what possibly would trip people up, or what would trigger some people who may be fond of Jordan Peterson, is that they'll say, well, but if you look, he's very careful in what he says. He adds disclaimers. He says, I don't know if I'm right about this, or this is just me speculating. And he does do that. But in most occasions, it doesn't prevent him from then going on to speculate. And then he very rarely returns to topics and corrects, where he's wrong. Like, to give an example, recently, he appeared with Brett Weinstein, and they, at one point during their wide-ranging discussion, he suggests that maybe hospitals are killing or harming more people than they're helping.
He disclaimed that a whole bunch, didn't he? Like, I don't know if this is true. Yeah.
So, but he did have disclaimers, but they're kind of beautifully crafted, because he said, I don't know, that might not be true, but it also might not be true. And that's true. That's always true, right? Like, both things could be.
I'm confused. Correct. All I heard was hospitals kill people.
Yeah, but obviously, and people will then do the work for Jordan in an extent, but they'll go and they'll find, oh, look, there was this study that said the third leading cause of death was a hospital, accident or misadventure, whatever. But if you just go a bit further, you find that no, that study was heavily criticized. There is very little debate that despite superbugs and whatnot that exist in hospitals, that they are not killing more people than they're helping. And it should be obvious, right? Because hospitals around the world, they're dealing with infectious illnesses, helping people give birth, all the vaccines that we are not currently debating about. So but he can throw that speculation out there, and then people will defend it as long as there's disclaimers, and there basically won't be follow-up. If there is follow-up, it will be, he'll retweet a paper, something about superbugs, and say, oh, people laughed at me for saying that. But he and many of the other gurus will rarely, just say, well, I looked into that more and it turned out, yeah, that was wrong. I really got that one wrong. And in another respect, the issue I think with Jordan Peterson, and it's common across the guru set, is that they'll talk about things where they actually have expertise and knowledge, and often they'll give good information there. He gave a nice description once about multiple regressions and how they work. But then he'll talk about, for example, cultures having this symbolic representation of entwined snakes. And how that,
meaning DNA.
Yeah.
Yes.
And people,
that was the final straw for me. Like, I'm sorry, the staff of Asclepius with the two snakes going up the staff is not a representation of DNA. Give me a break. Like, that's just ridiculous.
But people will say, well, but he said he's just, throwing ideas out and so on. But like, what is he actually suggesting there? That, pre-modern people had some intuitive knowledge of the structure of DNA and represented it in their cultural artifacts. Like, it is something that deserves criticism. So yeah, I think that disclaimers do a lot of work for gurus, especially secular gurus. And we talked with some experts in, traditional cults and religious gurus, and they said that in their experience, those disclaimers are not so forthcoming from people in that sphere. Their authority is very important. Whereas if you want to be a scientific secular guru, at least showing a willingness to have, doubt, that's actually increases your credibility. But it misleads
we're getting
people.
bogged down on this one point, but it also gives you deniability in something that can actually be numerically tested. If I start my cult and I claim that there are 130,000 angels that will carry each one of my followers up to the 18th plane of existence after they die, after they give me all their money and then they die, then that's not testable. That's not really provable. I don't need to disclaim it. But if I say something like hospitals kill more people than they save, that is testable, that is provable. I had better add some disclaimers there in case there's a really big study showing that I'm wrong.
Yeah, there's an article by Michael Marsh on the Skeptic UK, if anybody's interested, that goes through the numbers. But yes, you're right. Yes, specifically addressing the Jordan Peterson's claim. So, yeah.
Well, if anyone wants a handle on those, wants a hand from those 13,000 angels to the 17th plane of existence, I'm not taking Bitcoin anymore since Elon, tanked it. but I am still taking Ethereum. So make sure to send that. So the next one is cultishness. So this is, we had to define guru. How would you define cultishness?
So we are, for us, we are focusing on the degree to which there's a sharp in-group, out-group boundary created, and the sense that the members who are part of the in-group are, the people willing to look at issues in a more complex way, and that there is a connected demonization or disparaging of the out-group as, that tends to be the sheeple, the people who go along, those who just follow the mainstream media narratives, that view. So this is really quite common, and in the Web 2.0 era, it can also relate to parasocial and manipulative elements of interacting with your audience, like in discords, private discords, or various monthly Patreon chats or so on.
Yeah. So if we want to go to non-secular, if we want to go to religious examples, there's tons and tons of, Jim Jones. I just finished listening to the Martyr Made podcast 7 or 6-part series on Jim Jones, and it's an astounding story arc. And if anyone wants an example of you could make an argument it was a secular cult, because by the end they were way more communist than they were Christian. But how does this apply in a non-religious setting? If I'm not making special promises about the afterlife, if I'm not making special promises about God or gods treating you better for being in the cult, then how does this manifest itself? And can you give us another example other than Jordan Peterson in your guru hit list?
Sure, I can give you two. So one is Eric Weinstein. You might view what he's offering his community as relatively abstract, because he presents it as being about just examining science.
Contrarianism on everything.
Yes, that as well. But for him particularly, he has developed a theory of everything, a purported theory of everything, geometric unity. And a lot of the people that are attracted to his community, they tend to be disenchanted with things like academia or traditional sources of knowledge. And Eric encourages them to, start to dig into advanced calculus and the mathematics necessary to properly understand his theory. Now, the problem there is not with encouraging people to seek out alternative education sources, right? There's loads of good things available, MOOCs and whatnot. Now, it doesn't have to all be funneled into a traditional academic environment. But there's also an issue that, you need a fundamental basic level before you're getting into advanced geometry and, the theoretical physics discussion. And it isn't something that you can replace with just a couple of months Googling around. And
it's even harder to verify if he won't actually release his theory ever, because we are not worthy.
Well, yes, that comes up. Although now he has released after over a decade of people asking him, he did release a paper relatively recently, but it was, to put it mildly, underwhelming and received as such. He actually caveats it by saying at first that it's a work of entertainment, that he's not a scientist. But in any case, I think that in some respect is just the hook. Because what you're also being offered is this whole insight into behind the curtain view of the world. Very recently, John McAfee died, right? And Eric has hinted in various sources that this was very likely a targeted assassination, that it was intended to send a message to people. And he'll make reference to terms which sound intellectually sophisticated and complex theories to introduce a conspiratorial worldview, and one which often puts him and various figures in his orbit in a central position. But the important thing that it does for the audience is draw them into that they are seen by, through the curtain, and they're getting access to what's really going on in the world, and in a less nefarious way. But I think there's a similar issue, is Sam Harris's promise with his meditation app. Now, there's nothing wrong with encouraging people to take up introspective practices and making an app to help them do that. But what Sam did on a recent podcast that we looked at was essentially strongly imply, might be the kindest way to put it, that if you follow the introspective practices that he outlines, that you will, one, more deeply appreciate his worldview, and it's the only way to properly grasp it. You can't grasp it just through intellectual engagement. And secondly, that it would reveal to you that lots of the things that he says about identity and determinism and consciousness and free will, that they're actually provably correct via introspective methods. And so it's kind of this assumption that anybody who gets involved with those meditative practices that he outlines will inevitably come to agree with him, and and I just don't think that's actually true in my experience with introspective practices. It does not require adopting Sam Harris's worldview.
It doesn't inevitably lead to I mean, valid or not valid though his views on free will might be, and I tend to be more on his side, I don't think it inevitably leads to, in meditation, inevitably leads to a sense that there is no such thing as free will. They're two different things. Nor does it lead me to the perfect chocolate orange cake recipe.
Yeah, it's exactly that. There's no issue with even, using your insights from meditation to support your argument, but it's just this kind of presentation that if you follow the recipe set out by the guru, that you will, be initiated into their enlightened worldview. And Sam did put things in those terms. So
I find the worldview perpetuated or implied by Brett and Eric Weinstein more worrying, because as opposed to, hey, you're going to see that my views on free will or whatever are correct, it's basically indoctrination into the idea of a worldwide conspiracy theory on everything. And I think that's the border of the cult. Do you believe that everything is a conspiracy or could be a conspiracy, that the same system that has suppressed the brilliance of, Eric Weinstein and his brother Brett Weinstein is also responsible for suppressing the efficacy of ivermectin, is also responsible for, killing John McAfee, is also that idea of a worldwide conspiracy, that's, to me, is very clearly a cult. I mean, it's kind of the greater QAnon cult. I realize there's problems with QAnon. It's not a traditional cult. And right now, cult researchers are struggling with how do online cults differ from old school cults. But I'm going to call it a cult, and that would fit perfectly.
I think it fits with the next characteristic that we have on the Gurometer, anti-establishmentarianism, as we put it. But like an unwieldy term. But the point is that any institution or that can be presented as, the mainstream, the orthodox, that those are inherently to be regarded as suspicion. I think Eric has put it once that nearly everyone in all institutions is lying to you all of the time. It's something like that. And
that's a big statement.
It is, yes. And but it's a sentiment that you see everywhere in the guru sphere. And it doesn't matter, if you're looking at left-wing gurus or right-wing gurus or spiritual gurus, this sentiment is universal to them. And there's all of these things tend to exist on the spectrum, right? It's healthy to have to not trust everything that the government says, uncritically. It's healthy not to just follow whatever the latest academic fad is, or to assume that all medical knowledge and, scientific knowledge is at its zenith. No, we know that's not true. And we know that there are nefarious agencies that are engaged in conspiracies or spinning things, right? But those truths are not what the gurus are suggesting. They're instead suggesting that basically all of the establishment institutions and efforts to rely, to care about expert opinion or so on, are based on an invalid authority, which is actually just designed to deceive and usually to profit, rather than to, for example, pretty much all of the efforts currently ongoing with the vaccination and to curb the coronavirus are presented as really being about, self-interest or pharmaceutical companies making profit. And they, this was with hydroxychloroquine and now with ivermectin, that the people promoting it are advocating that it's all a ploy to kind of prevent the people from getting access to a cheap, safe alternative. And yeah, you cannot overestimate how common anti-establishment sentiment is and how appealing it is. And I mean, if you live in America or just have to deal with America, it's populist sentiment is everywhere at the minute. And it's not just in the online sphere, it's in politics. And
it's also it's a very convenient and self-serving point of view, worldview to promote for the guru, because if everybody is lying to you, then who is your source of truth? Clearly, it's the person who told you that everyone is lying to you.
Yes, exactly. And my co-host Matt often highlights that a lot of this attack on establishment sources is used to buttress the guru's own claim to authority. And so it is remarkably self-serving, and it often, it presents a somewhat cartoonish version of the world instead of dealing with, governments that don't always make the right decisions, scientists who may misstate something or might disagree over something, or public health authority which has to make, various cost-benefit analysis and might change their decision on something as being nefarious. All of that is nefarious. It can't just be, the messy reality of the world. It's all secret cabals behind the scenes plotting out how they're going to manipulate the public.
I was trying to think of other examples of this. I mean, we've whipped on the Weinsteins for a bit, but I mean, it's basically every anti-vaxxer ever would be an example of this, and they're coming out of the woodwork in droves.
Yes.
So from Christian Northrup to...
I think a lot of the, if people had an interest in, skepticism or or previously atheism, that a lot of the tactics are very familiar. If you have looked into, how alternative medicine and supplements have been promoted for decades, it's very similar. The way that they seek to discredit medical authorities or, peer review, and the way that the gurus do. So in that sense, they're not doing something novel. They're just applying it to a new arena, which tends to be politics and the culture war.
Yeah. To quote my friends over at the Conspirituality podcast, you should listen to what they're saying and then look at what they're selling. And most of the time, when they're disparaging whatever, vaccination, say, they're also selling an immunity-boosting supplement, right? I mean, Alex Jones does sell Immune Force. Joe Rogan, one of his frickin' shroom tech products is like immune tech. I forget what it is. JP Sears is busy. I mean, he's maybe not guru, but they are selling.
He'd like to be,
yeah.
I think accords nicely with it's actually the 10th feature that we've listed, but I think it's worth mentioning here that we initially called it grifting, but that term is overused. So I think it's more accurate to talk about profiteering, and exactly what you say about the amount of people in the sphere who are promoting supplements, who you would be quite surprised, what relevance does somebody offering political commentary have to supplement shilling? Or, Joe Rogan has never met an alternative treatment that he didn't endorse or and he what's his brand that I think they got a massive payout? Alpha Brain?
On it.
Yes,
Brain.
yes.
Yeah, Alpha Brain, the supplement that was tested by, I forget, Aubrey Marcus's brother-in-law or something like that. Laboratory proven, but the laboratory was owned by either. I should have this at the tip of my brain, but I think it was Aubrey Marcus's brother or cousin or something who ran the lab, and it designed the study and then ran the study. Like, oh yeah, and probably got 10% of the company for that.
Yes, and it's, even when you look at the studies, there's like 20 outcomes, right? And they just highlight the two that get significant increases. Like, it's all well-known ways that you're not, well, you are in a sense lying, but essentially you're torturing data to get, a pattern which you can wrap up in a bow and say to people, it's proven.
I know that experimental design is really important to you. And so back when I was doing my my master's, my supervisor warned me about, getting a giant data set that measured 85 different variables, then running a bunch of analyses, finding 2 or 3 correlations and going, that's what I was looking for all along. Because if you have a big enough data set, you will find, just by chance, correlations. So if they did Alpha Brain and they measured 85 different measures of performance, memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, reaction time, physical reaction time. I don't know how they did it, but you can conjure up data. You can conjure up relationships out of nothing.
Exactly. There's a concept that called data fishing, or and a related concept of p-hacking. But in data fishing, if you, like you say, if you collect a big range of variables and then you have statistic methods which rely on, and usually they do use this p under 0.05, which gives you an average error rate of under 5%, right? That if you'll get a false positive 5% of the time, or in the long term. And that might sound like an acceptable error rate, but that only works if you do like one test, right? Mm-hmm. So if you do 100 tests, it's no surprise that you can find, 5 or 7 or so that are significant. That's what you would expect, even if there was no relationship. Mm-hmm. So this is what you also see currently with like the ivermectin studies, and clinical. This is like a really familiar thing, that clinical trials, not just the kind of alternative fringe treatments, but drug companies do this a lot as well, like mainstream pharmaceutical companies, where they'll measure lots of outcomes and they'll only report the ones that are, that make the results look good. And this can be assuaged to some extent by requiring that trials are pre-registered, right? That the outcomes are specified in advance. But when you do that, things tend to become less impressive. The results are, there's a dramatic decrease. They've compared pre-registered and non-pre-registered studies. But like, if you took the ivermectin trial,
can you explain a pre-registered study? Say you and I are going to do a study on ivermectin, and I think earlier I called it invermectin, so I apologize to everyone yelling at me right now. I was worked up. You and I are going to do an ivermectin trial, and we want to find a positive effect because we have stock in ivermectin, or we want to tank the stock of Pfizer or whatever. How would we do that?
Yeah, so if we're imagining ourselves as nefarious characters who want, or just motivated people who want a specific outcome, what you would do is then collect a large amount of data, and you won't specify it anywhere. You'll get the results and you'll look for relationships that show some positive effect. Ivermectin, maybe it reduces over 30 days the severity of symptoms, or maybe over 15 days, if we have like multiple longitudinal, you get less severe headaches, but you have another 50 symptoms that you measured. So what you tend to do, if you want to make that look, if you want to, make the case for ivermectin, is you drop all those non-significant ones, or you take a handful of them and you focus on the positive ones and you report them in the study. And then, in your abstract and whatnot, you kind of highlight the most impressive ones. And the study gets not recorded as a positive result for ivermectin. All of those things which didn't show an improvement get put into your so-called file drawer and put away. So if people could see all that data that was, less impressive, then the results would be less convincing. But that's not what people tend to do. Now, the replication crisis, or like in recent years, people may or may not be aware that there was a crisis, especially focused in social psychology, but across the social sciences more generally, that studies were unable to be replicated. And this was part of the reason for it, that it seemed to be that there was a publication bias, people selecting positive results, not reporting negative results, and it skews the literature. So one of the solutions is that you require, or at least reward people for, before they run the study, or at least before they analyze the data, they publicly record what they are measuring and what they anticipate the relationship to be. And then, regardless of the outcome, they need to report it. And when you do this, you start to find that results are much less impressive, much more negative results are recorded, but it is not a pre-requirement in most fields that studies are pre-registered. And if you look at like ivermectin studies that are being touted in meta-analyses, there's hardly any that are pre-registered designs, as far as I'm aware. So, there's a lot. It doesn't have to be that people are fabricating data or even playing around with, other medications being used at the same time. There are just various statistical methods that you can use to get positive results from messy data. And they're well known. So it's a problem.
Yeah. I mean, this is one hell of a rabbit hole. I promise we're going to get back to the Gurometer. But at some point, somebody's going to be saying, see, I told you all statistics are lies. And I don't think this is true, because it's statisticians who've pointed this out. It's statisticians who've come up with correction methods. I remember I always called it the Biffaroni correction.
Boniferroni correction.
The Boniferroni correction that you have to apply, and that's way beyond. I mean, this is a pretty nerdy audience, so there's probably some engineer or statistician who's glad we mentioned that. But I think it's well known that these are problems.
Yeah, so like the Boniferroni correction, I think can be understood simply that, like, if you're doing lots and lots of tests, you have to make your boundary for accepting error lower, because you're more likely to get errors if you're doing lots and lots of tests. So you make the boundary lower. But yes, these issues are known, have been identified by statisticians, by scientists for like over 100 years, I think nearly now. And there are also things that were taught in social science courses, like, the ones that I took during my undergraduate. This isn't like secret knowledge, but it was just that the standards in various fields have kind of allowed for bad practices to flourish, and we're getting the consequences of like studies that don't replicate and unreliable things. But like I say, this is maybe worst in social psychology and some of the social sciences, but it's also an issue in drug trials and pharmaceuticals. So this is why it's quite annoying to deal with, the kind of guru sphere, because there are lots of legitimate criticisms to be made about pharmaceutical companies, and you shouldn't just say, oh, there's a positive trial, so that means it's been validated. But they don't actually get into this kind of, the details about the actual issues. Like, that's left to books like Bad Science or Bad Pharmaceuticals by Ben Goldacre, and Stuart Ritchie had a very good book recently called Science Fictions. These are looking at, the actual problems, but they're not the kind of thing that will give you a massive YouTube following.
Okay. Thank you for indulging me. I apologize to everyone who's completely zoned out. Gurometer, red flag for grievance-mongering. And I certainly, when I listen to two people that we've already talked about, well, three, both of the Weinsteins, and Jordan Peterson, they're forever talking about how much they've suffered. They've suffered. My YouTube channel has gotten so very large. My seminars are now, I make $100,000 every time I talk publicly, but I have suffered. Can we find another example of, I'm assuming grievance-mongering is, a sense of oppression or a narrative of oppression on the part of the guru. And can we find other examples other than the people I've just mentioned?
Yeah, so I think it refers to a tendency to bring up like how you've been treated unfairly, and like I tend to view it as thinking that you have a list of enemies that you will try to wedge into most conversations, whether or not it's relevant, and it's a common feature. I think like we haven't covered these people on the podcast yet, but to take an example which is out of the IDW sphere, I think you would find this amongst those that tend to be like tankies or in the broad anti-imperialist area. So this would be like journalists from the gray zone, like Max Blumenthal and Ben Norris and whatnot, or Glenn Greenwald is another example. Now, whether they fit exactly into the guru characteristics, they probably wouldn't be as high scoring as some of like the Weinsteins or so on. But I think they are an example of people who have long-standing grievances, often with particular journalists or academics, and that or institutions, and they'll kind of seek to like I say, bring it up in whatever context that they can, and as with all things, it's on a spectrum, because like there's always people that you will that you might disagree with, that you want to prove wrong or something like that, but it's the level at which it exists, which is what marks gurus out as unique, and they also will often refer to things that happened like decades ago, about them being censored by various institutions or academic authorities. So yeah, it's not on its own a sure shot that you're dealing with a guru, but if it comes up and the other features are present, then it's not a good sign.
Yeah, it's a fairly common. I'm not sure that it alone makes you a guru, but almost all gurus, there's somebody out to get them.
Yeah, persecution narratives are really, really common, and even in the way it's almost inevitable that a guru will regard journalists as having treated them unfairly. There's very rarely any coverage that is not of the fawning variety, which is considered reasonable.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a number of cult leaders, and all of them were, again, Jim Jones. It was fairly certain that the U.S. government was out to get him, and made that kind of a central theme of his cult. And like, let's move to Guyana, and let's get ready for the U.S. Special Forces and the mercenaries to come get us. And there were no special forces in the jungle, and there were no mercenaries. And
in a Japanese example, Om Shinrikyo, the cult which released sarin gas on the Tokyo subway, after they failed in an attempt to win an election, like they took part in I can't remember if it was for parliament or for the Tokyo mayor seat, but I think it was for parliament. In any case, they contested an election and they were completely failed, right? They received very little votes. And after that, they became more insular and more focused on, it kind of created an incentive, I think, to lean into violence. And I'm not saying that happens with the majority of gurus, but just that being rejected by the outside world is a common motif.
I can't resist. I shouldn't. Did they think that the election had been stolen from them?
Yes. There are parallels there, but
I'm not drawing any parallels. I'm innocently asking a question, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any issue with noting that U.S. politics, that it's become. I mean, all politics around the world are to some extent farcical in nature now, but the thing, something like a claim that the election has been stolen via tampering with voter systems or whatever. Again, like you said, that's something you can actually check. People have done studies. There's been audits completely out of this election cycle about how robust the US system is to withstanding voter ballot fraud. And all of the assessments are that the level of fraud needed to sway an election in the way that's claimed, it's not possible given the current system. Or if it is possible, it would require, a massive conspiracy and so on. But so we shouldn't, I think it's a shame that there's any hesitation on people from any side of the political aisle to say, no, that's a conspiracy theory that is wrong. It should be on the same level of people that are talking about chemtrails and stuff. But it's treated as, it's especially now treated as, well, that's just it's a difference of opinion. But it's actually a difference of facts.
Well, you're entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts. But apparently, that rule was suspended in 2020 and has not come back yet. On a completely unrelated topic, number 5, narcissism and self-aggrandisement. As a red flag or as a scoring on the Gurometer. Can you give us some examples of this?
Well, I think Matt would tend to say that this is probably the most core feature, that recurrent feature that we see across our gurus, is this grandiosity and tendency to place themselves as a central hub in whatever event or whatever political, goings on that they're discussing, even if that's wildly unrealistic, or they're a Twitch streamer or whatever the case may be. And you see it across pretty much the whole spectrum. Like, we've covered people like Russel Brand, who probably, although he actually does lean relatively close to the IDW sphere these days, but
IDW, intellectual dark web, yes?
Yes, intellectual dark web, who some people think that term is anachronistic to an extent because the group has somewhat diverged and split apart. But I think it's a useful family resemblance category to refer to a group of contrarian style thinkers.
Yeah, we happy few.
Yeah, and so like someone like Russel Brand is quite obviously, I'd say, just a classical narcissist. Like, he's a Hollywood celebrity who's famed for his self-indulgent lifestyle and behavior. But in terms of as a guru characteristic, when you look at his content, it's very much focused around his insights, his revolutionary theories, and the Weinsteins, they're often the prototypical example to go to, but both of them claim to have theories that will revolutionize fields, that are Nobel-worthy insights, right? It's not just people saying, oh, I have some theoretical models that are interesting and might be good to explore. It has to be more than that. And I think that fits with the persecution complex that we just talked about, because you can only have that sense that you're that important to the world if you see yourself as, a once in a lifetime figure. And like I mentioned Eric Weinstein talking about John McAfee, the connection there was that he was very concerned that he will be the next figure to be whacked by the CIA or whoever it is as a message. So he thinks Jeffrey
the assassins
Epstein,
that are hired by all the universities in the United States.
yes, exactly. The physicists, the string theorists who are upset with him, getting in on their gig. But it's Jeffrey Epstein, John McAfee, and next possibly Eric. And like, it almost doesn't require saying why. That's just a very skewed perspective of the priorities of the CIA.
Yeah. Well, are you familiar with this idea of the dark triad? I don't know how pop psychology that is, but it's
I think it's relatively well established, as far as personality psychology goes.
So I know that one leg of that dark triad is narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think of the guru space, there's no shortage of, yoga gurus who ended up, let's pick Bikram. He's a popular whipping boy, but it's amazing how popular this is in other martial arts spaces. And it has existed in the martial arts space and the jiu-jitsu space as well, where you find out that some teacher has been, chi healing underage girls in his hot tub, or inviting them home for special energy massages. Or it's not at all surprising. And that narcissism, along with, what are they, Machiavellianism and psychopathy. Are... So and when you're looking at all your gurus, I don't see you casting that many aspersions on their moral character. And I haven't heard the term dark triad come up. Is it you've just concentrated on the currently relevant ones and not the ones that have fallen from grace, not the ones that have, disgraced themselves by, running some kind of sex slave ring in the 70s?
Well, I think it's more a case that like Machiavellianism and psychopathy in particular, almost by definition involve a willingness to appear sincere and to not be sincere, right? To manipulate people. And it's just my judgment. I can't tell, right? Like, I don't have the ability to get inside people's heads. I can only look at what they say and do. But my assessment would be that the majority of gurus that we look at are sincere in that they believe themselves to be essentially the heroes in the story. They aren't out knowingly manipulating people. It depends on, there's exceptions to this, but so I'm just speaking generally overall, that sometimes when I'm discussing the topic of gurus with other people, they're always wondering, what's the profit angle, or like, why are they promoting this thing that they know is fake? And I don't think that's the case in most instances. Now, there's bound to be a spectrum where, to some extent, somebody might, be profiting from promoting on its supplements, and then they are incentivized to find the research compelling and or to even create the research to support that claim. But like, if you ask me,
you could spin that the other way. You could say this person is so convinced by, I don't know, the quote research and the life-changing effects of vagina-scented candles and essential oils that they then moved into that space, that it wasn't the belief, the profits driving the beliefs. It was the beliefs that then caused them to promote this, because they truly do believe that essential oils can cure cancer.
Yeah. And so I think, if you ask me, like, does Joe Rogan buy into the various supplements and stuff that he promotes? I would say, like, probably yes for most of them. And for the other ones, he probably takes a, well, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't attitude to it. And but he's never someone who's demonstrated that he, isn't gullible to like alternative medicine advocates promoting treatments with very little evidence of efficacy. So, it gets a bit more complicated when you look at people who are kind of serial contrarians. They're basically adopting various positions on whatever topic happens to be in the center of public interest right now. But again, I think assuming that those people actually know what they're doing and they're not also victims to their own self of, grandiosity and belief in their insights is potentially misguided, because it's very easy for people to make themselves the heroes of their own story. And if you look at like classic anti-vaccine advocates, there's exceptions, but the majority of them, to me, seem to be people who regard themselves as doing the right thing for, children and whatnot. And even QAnon, the stated values, whether or not they demonstrate that in actually what they do, it does cast you as somebody fighting against a cabal of, secret pedophiles. So,
I certainly I don't know how cynical the people at the top are. I'm maybe a little bit more cynical about the people at the top being more cynical, but I'm in the last year I've run up against a whole lot of the QAnon and QAnon adjacent spaces, and not so much the straight guru spaces. But the analogy that I've used is, if you're in Japan and you tell me, Stephan, here's a car. In Japan, a red light means go and a green light means stop. And you double check that. Like, I finally understand. A red light in Japan means go and a green light means stop. And I go out and I drive through an intersection and I get hit by a truck and I die. I was making a genuine decision, a good decision based on shitty data. So
you just trusted the wrong person.
Yeah. So now, how much of that is happening up top? I don't know. If you look at the granddaddy of the modern anti-vaccine movement, Andrew Wakefield, I mean, he definitely had.
Yeah.
I mean, he was not making decisions based on good data. He was manufacturing data outright and had a huge vested interest in getting rid of, the triple MMR vaccine, so that, guess what? He could sell his individual vaccines. This is a huge, huge problem, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, I've got the solution, and I'm going to make $1 billion if I get proven right, or if people.
Not to mention the immorality of performing, unnecessary surgical procedures on children who are like at a birthday party and whatnot. But Andrew Wakefield is a remarkable man in so many ways. But and I think you're right that there are people who, whether or not they are able to maintain in their head that they're acting in good faith, is almost immaterial. Like Mike Cernovich or Dave Rubin, for example. Whether or not they're gurus is a different question, but I think Cernovich definitely would count as that. Rubin probably has aspirations too. But they, on some level, they do know that they are presenting things in a partisan way and that they're not caring about standards of evidence. They find, they know stories that have been proven wrong, and they're just interested in promoting partisan things. And in the same way, there are people who will learn that, studies have been discredited, and then they'll still cite them. And now, ultimately, whether those people feel like they're doing that in good faith or they're justified to do it or not, like this is why in one sense, I don't really care what their internal story in their mind is, whether they're a Machiavellian manipulator or a sincere believer. I care more about like what they promote and what they do. And it's an easy criticism and way to dismiss your points that you would make if somebody gets labeled bad faith, right? This is like a really common thing that people will say, those people were looking at, these gurus, but they were acting in bad faith. They didn't extend any charity. So I don't think you can orientate everything around that, but I think you can defang that to some extent by not focusing on so much, interpreting the internal mental states of the people that you're looking at. So
fair enough. You don't need to open the window into men's souls. You just need to look at what they do.
Yeah, it's window enough because the insecurities and the grandiosity are on full display. So yeah, I think that on the flip side, people who say that, the personal characteristics or what someone is doing across unrelated domains is like an invalid thing to care about. It isn't, because sometimes it tells you about standards of evidence, and sometimes it tells you about the networks that they're into, or how easily they can distinguish scientific positions. So if somebody is like believing that the moon landing was hoaxed as an adult, it tells you that they can't do very good research on that topic, right?
Oh, they've done tons of research. YouTube has fed them endless. I think the pinned tweet on my my Twitter is still a YouTube video. Watching YouTube is not doing research.
No. So that's why I said good research, because the philosopher T. Newen, who we talked on like one of our podcasts, and he does a lot of stuff about online social media dynamics, and he talked about how it's wrong to see the people enmeshed in conspiracy or partisan communities as being unaware of the counter arguments or not spending time on topics, because like the ivermectin and anti-vaccine people, they spend hours every day on these topics, and they know the names of studies, they know the names of researchers. It's wrong to view it as like, if you just expose them to the correct sources, that they'll change their opinion, because that's not the way it operates. And I think it's important that people don't make that mistake of, assuming that people don't know, because then when you encounter someone that's deep into a conspiracy theory, they'll be able to completely swamp you with information that you won't be able to, you won't be aware of, or you won't be able to counteract. So you have to be aware that simply knowing loads of details doesn't actually make you better informed, or, to have done proper research on a topic.
Yeah, it's the Gish Gallop topic. And I once watched Duane Gish, who was a scientific creationist. So basically that's an argument that I'm sure but for the people who are listening, an argument that the Bible is an exact story of creation. And, argue with a professor of evolutionary biology, Graham Bell, at McGill, who was brilliant, but not accustomed to bad faith debates. And he was completely unable to deal with the so-called Gish Gallop, or Gish Gallop, but I like Gish Gallop better, of just, where you spit out 85, quote, facts in rapid succession. And then this, and then that, and then, you could do it about ivermectin. And then this person found this, and this other doctor found that, and then this here, and this study there, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, okay. Let me start with point number 1, and let me spend 10 minutes, disassembling point number 1. But now they've gone on and done another 85 points, and just overwhelming. Basically, it's a fire hose of potentially disinformation. And it was fascinating to watch the Gish Gallop in action by Duane Gish.
The founder.
It was amazing.
Stephan, you mentioned like alienating your audience or some portion. I think I will probably alienate the majority with this comment, but I see that exact dynamic at play in the various advocates for the so-called lab leak hypothesis currently. And I don't just see that amongst fringe conspiracy theorists. I see it amongst well-informed public intellectuals and like analysts like Nate Silver and whatnot. And I'm not making the case that we shouldn't look into the possibility of a lab leak, or that or that we should trust that the CCP has been entirely transparent about everything since the beginning. Like, no, you should actually have that as your default position, right? So it's not that suspicious if the CCP is not being transparent, because they aren't transparent. But that has, I see that exact tendency of, reeling off these individual facts in a way that is very reminiscent of 9/11 truthers. That will also annoy people. Yeah, and
I've just got this dial in my head of audience size, and it's just spinning counterclockwise right now. Thank you. Go on. Yeah. Go on.
Well, because this is examples that, like, everybody can sort of beat up on anti-vaxxers or chemtrail people, but something like the lab leak, because it's now a popular narrative, including in the liberal media, and that it's kind of shifted. The story is that scientists were too dismissive and everybody was vilified, and now we're having to reassess it because there's been these new worrying facts emerging. And, like, again, I would contest that if you were following the literature, if you're listening to the mainstream virologist community discuss it, it was never off the table. And
it's a series of headlines
taken
from, if some virologist said this is unlikely, but it's possible, the headline will be virologists deny that this could possibly be a lab leak.
Yes, and even if there is a case where somebody overstates or makes a claim, like yes, that happens. Scientists are people, so they make overstatements, and journalists also select quotes that are inflammatory and whatnot. But, like, if you look at the research literature and various discussions, it has never been completely off the table. People have talked about it, and there was I'll get off this after this point, but there was that letter that came out in Science, the Science magazine, about the group of scientists saying, we need to explore all possibilities. And in that very letter, they note that this stance is the stance of the WHO, the EU, and the American government, right? But it's treated as if it's this fringe position that nobody was ever allowed to utter. And it's what I see is that, setting aside that there are some articles that were, like, too dismissive, or that, like, that's always going to happen with every topic. Sure. That actually what they were reacting to is what you see a lot in the lab leak communities, which is this kind of rampant conspiracism and anomaly hunting and these kind of features. So even if it turned out that the lab leak was true, it wouldn't make someone like Alex Jones's approach correct, right? Who has, like, obviously endorsed that the Chinese created the virus and whatnot. So it's just the point that you can criticize the conspiratorial tendencies and the rampant conspiracy mongering without dismissing any possibility for there to be a lab leak. That's all. So, yeah, this will be very unpopular. But this is the true fringe position now. This is the contrarian view.
I've been asked, and I've had strong opinions. There's some areas that I've got a fairly strong background in statistics, and I did a whole lot of reading of actual publications, actual journal publications, and people just have no idea what a journal publication is on things like, I don't know, the infection fatality rate of COVID. So that's something that I feel fairly confident, not to have done my own research, but to say, here's what the dominant here's 12 studies that have been done on this. 10 of them say that it's a pretty serious infection fatality rate, and here's one by Dr. John Ioannidis that says it's a very low rate. So right now here's a really big studies, here's some 11 really big studies, and here's one really small one. When it comes to pronouncing judgment on the lab leak hypothesis, you'd need to be an expert in viral genomics. You'd need to be, especially if you're arguing that this thing's been biologically engineered, but you need to be an expert in viral genomics and coronavirus distributions in nature and the prevalence of viruses making the jump from animal hosts to humans. That's, again, each one of those, you could spend an entire career on one small aspect of it. So people should be more happy saying, I don't know,
Yes.
as opposed to, this is the way it is, which I suppose takes us back to our first point, galaxy-brainness.
Yeah. And, there's a tendency to, like, on any topic, as you just hinted at, or outright stated, actually, I should say, whenever you review the scientific literature, like, you can develop this skill, right? Like an ability to spend time, review the research literature, and get an idea about what the general consensus is. But when you do that, you will always find outlier opinions, and you'll always find experts who are very confident in criticizing, whatever consensus view. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not, but in maybe the majority of occasions they're not right. And I see a tendency for people not to be able to factor that in. They seem to kind of just glom on to whichever expert has issued an opinion which fits with their intuitions, as opposed to, looking through the evidence and then making a relatively informed view. But even on that point, like you say, it should be something that everyone gets, that most people were not virologists a year ago. Most people were not epidemiologists. And yet everyone now has these very strong opinions on these topics that people have devoted their careers to. And maybe, I don't think it's that insulting to say to people, you maybe don't know as much about the topic as people who have devoted their research careers to it. And
how many people who do not know matrix algebra or differential calculus, and I would include myself in that, have very strong opinions about how Weinstein has been suppressed in academia and how his theory of geometric unity is not being taken seriously. Yeah. I'm not saying that a knowledge of differential calculus and matrix algebra is sufficient, but surely it would be necessary. If you can't fold a 12-dimensional matrix, I don't know. Now I'm coming to the limits of the one course I did on matrix algebra because I hated it. But if you can't invert it and refold it and whatever the hell they do with those stupid matrices in your sleep, you're probably not qualified to have an opinion on whether your guru is being persecuted correctly or not.
Yeah, and I can say that the thing that I can identify reliably, because of the amount of time I've spent and interest in it, is when a community has characteristics that are in line with a truther movement or conspiracy communities. And you can identify that, and it's kind of a completely independent feature from what the topic that the community is geared towards, right? Like I say, it could turn out that the origin of the virus is the lab, but that wouldn't make all of the dynamics surrounding that any less conspiracy prone or,
Well, how many predictions has Alex Jones made? I'll pick a number. 10,000. Or let's cut that by, let's say 1,000 predictions. Some of them are going to be right just by accident, right? I mean, if I was a hydroxychloroquine person a year ago, then I was a vitamin D person, then I was vitamin D plus magnesium, then I was vitamin D plus calcium. Now I'm ivermectin. Next week I'm ivermectin plus oil of oregano. Eventually, one of these magic combinations, just by chance, is going to be correct, and then I will never ever shut up about it ever again. Just like if you take a complex data set, you find the one relationship that occurred by chance and write your paper around that. I'm going to make 1,000 predictions. I'll be Nostradamus. And then one of the predictions I make will be correct, and I'll never shut up about it ever again. And I'll use that as proof for the rest of time.
And it's worse than that, because you can, if you're setting the criteria, what counts as a hit is, it's entirely subjective. So
My friend took ivermectin and they got better, and therefore I've proved my own theory.
Oh, there's a meta-analysis, right? That was or Oxford is studying ivermectin as a potential treatment. Therefore,
which is true.
Yeah,
I think that's true.
It is, but that's the thing. Like, so when people criticize like Brett Weinstein for promoting the treatment, then somebody else will link and say, "Oh, what do you have to say now? Oxford are doing a study, a clinical study on its efficacy," and you like, I can see the connection that people are making in their minds about that. That like he's calling for more studies, and look, there's a study from a legitimate institution, but the point is, nobody is saying we shouldn't get evidence and do clinical studies of ivermectin. That is all going on completely independent of the
I might say that. I'm going to say that. You know why? I'm going to sound like Jordan Peterson here. But going back to hydroxychloroquine, how many studies were cobbled together at the last minute in the early days of COVID, and how many tens of millions of dollars were put into studies looking at hydroxychloroquine, which could have been put towards other things? I mean, they found the argument against Big Pharma controlling everything is that they did, thank God, they found like dexamethasone actually had increased survivability by something like a third using reasonably good science, and it's now part of the standard of care. But what if that tens of millions of dollars had been spent on other things that weren't essentially politically driven? Or try to debunk all these people who are like going to their doctors going, I want hydroxychloroquine, or drinking fish tank cleaner. So there is a cost to, Oxford is now studying this. What else could Oxford be studying? I'm sure they're still pretty interested in limiting the negative side effects of COVID.
Yeah, no, you're preaching to the choir in an extent, because, this pattern of promising results in vitro studies, and then more positive results from advocates and various low quality cobbled together studies, it's not a new pattern, right? And what 9 times out of 10 results in high quality randomized controlled trials get either much less impressive results or negative results. And that is very likely what will happen with ivermectin. But if I was in control of like where we're issuing all research funds, I might not regard it as like a high priority task. But I don't have any issue with people exploring the possibility, because if it turned out to be effective, then that's the thing. There wouldn't be opposition to adopting it, right? Because but that's the point, that like people are saying, oh, this has been silenced, nobody's studying it. And like the Oxford trial was not created in response to the podcast discussion between Pierre Corey, Joe Rogan, and Brett Weinstein, but he has hinted at that. Brett and Heller have suggested that, okay, there's an Oxford study now, but that we were talking about it a couple of months ago, and this is what, and I'm just listening to it going, no, that's not how clinical trials, they didn't decide this based on your podcast. But so yeah, I know we've gotten into the weeds with ivermectin, but
we have gotten, this is beyond a rabbit hole. This is now a full-on wormhole. So I'm going to hard break. Point 6, who is Cassandra, and what does she have to do with gurus? And are there any female gurus that you've covered? Because you do a pretty good job on beating up male gurus. I don't recall any female gurus.
Well, we've covered Gwyneth Paltrow.
That's right.
And ContraPoints. Okay. So but it is true to say that the overwhelming amount of gurus that we've looked at so far are males, and I think that speaks to that men are more dominant in the online secular guru space. But if you go into like the conspirituality sphere or the alternative wellness sphere, then you tend to see more female gurus. Like if you think about Jordan Peterson and his daughter, right? There's a clear split. His daughter is all about alternative treatments and a no meat diet, but her dad is about psychology and politics and all of the things that he's about. So myth. So I think that division is common. So there is a bias. There is a gender bias in ours. And in terms of the Cassandra-complex, that refers to a mythical or legendary figure who was warning about impending doom, right? And this tends to be really common, right? I'm not going to bring it back to ivermectin, but I am going to say that a lot of the gurus are hinting at the coming disaster, either from the woke revolution, where the American democracy is going to be replaced with Chinese style, Maoist communism, or that we're heading for serious issues with the long-term harm being done by the vaccines. And in most occasions, the gurus take great pleasure in presenting themselves as people who recognize the problem before anyone else could see it, right? They're the prophets of doom. And this is central to their self-perception and also how they validate that they have insights. They tend to, point out that they got something right, or that they were early getting to some issue that other people overlooked. So yeah, it's a common feature.
Is it almost? I mean, it's the essential feature of doomsday cults. Certainly, there's been no shortage of, the end times are coming in the year 1186. Whoops, we screwed up. 1187. Whoops, it didn't end. All right, we've read.
You have QAnon currently, right? Yeah. Fairly frequently saying that Trump's going to be reinstated by this date, or that Biden's going to be hung up and drawn and quartered at this date, and it doesn't happen. But it doesn't seem to strongly impact the support for that. Some people peel off, but the majority just rationalize it and move on to the next date.
The QAnon supporter that I'm closest to over the last 2 years gave me probably 10 warnings, like 10 specific dates, including, don't be traveling on this date, and then nothing happened that date. Don't be inside a tall building on this day because the earthquakes are going to get triggered, and then nothing happened. And then, this is going to be a really bad month. I think the best he got was that January of 2021 is going to be extremely turbulent. But I'm not going to accept that as any kind of prescient knowledge. I think that was fairly obvious in advance. But all these other dates were very, very specific. They were all kind of doom. It was kind of like a mixture of prophesying of doom and a revenge fantasy. Kind of. You take a look at the Turner Diaries, and the QAnon thing, and it's basically a giant wet dream fantasy about revenge.
Yeah. And so I think there's a lot to that. And, the gurus that we look at, they kind of, like I say, we're focusing on a modern manifestation. But like you mentioned with the Turner Diaries, or the Protocols of the Elder Zion, or Behold the Pale Horse, right, by Bill Cooper. These themes crop up all the time and are recurrent, and it's kind of, in the one hand, it's sort of impressive. I mean, this was a feature of cults that's long been remarked on, that their ability to persist after very specific predictions occur it's not an outlier feature. It's not like there's a whole bunch of cults where some figure predicted something and then it didn't come true and everybody just left it. Right? That tends to be not the pattern. So it's almost like there's a very little cost involved for people to make specific and outlandish predictions based on the point that you made, that if they get anything close to something happening, that it's taken as validation. And if it doesn't happen, there's always narratives, that it was, okay, this is a bigger part of the plan that we just don't get yet. Or it did occur, but Biden is a hologram, or whatever the case may be.
Or we averted it. It was going to happen for sure, but by us getting word out about it, there's a book that I think Matthew Remski mentioned to me, and I think it's called something like When Predictions Fail, or when that it's on the reading list on my phone, but it addresses that. It's the whole idea of like, how do cults survive making such crazy and very specific claims that then don't come true. Point
when
7,
prophecy fails.
Yeah, when prophecy fails. It's on my reading list. I'm looking forward to doing more reading this summer. Point 7, revolutionary theories. How is this different from Galaxy-brainness?
So Galaxy-brainness is the tendency to have like a wide breadth of knowledge across, or I believe that you have a broad breadth of knowledge across all these different topics. Revolutionary theories is more that you see yourself as having a theory that will revolutionize a specific field or area of study. So you've developed a kind of Nobel Prize level insight that is paradigm shifting or revolutionary, but usually has gone unrecognized. So that's the corollary, the unfortunate corollary. But it's not. Again, it's not an essential feature of a guru, but it goes hand in hand with being self-aggrandizing and narcissistic, that whatever your area of expertise, that you regard yourself as having something very, very important to say. It's not okay to just be a cog in a machine, right? That's the opposite of what a guru wants to see themselves as.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that most martial arts charlatans have something similar here, that nobody else has managed to figure out how to, channel chi to defeat multiple attackers without touching them quite the way that I have. Or I've invented leverage. Nobody else before me ever used leverage when fighting anybody. I am the inventor of leverage.
Well, you must also see this though in some of the like legitimate martial arts guru types, like that they might be giving information which or training which is legitimate and which has value, but if you can give it your own spin and kind of patent it, that it becomes a commodity. Like maybe this is unfair, but I'm thinking of the 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu guys, and the Eddie
there
Bravo.
Goes another 10% of my audience.
No, I think that system, as far as I know, perfectly legitimate training, good guys training and whatnot, but the kind of tendency to develop your own internal terminology.
Yes,
and
for sure. And that's I mean, there are legitimate 10th Planet guys, we will both say that, and they have invented an entirely new terminology that helps establish in-group and out-group. If you refer to this as I'm not up on my 10th planet. Yeah, you don't call it a double triangle half guard. You call it lockdown. That's a simple example. Or if this is the double penetrator crack pipe control. Okay. Yeah. That refers to something. Now, arguably, that's because there was no name for that position before, in which case coming up with a new name, I think, is semi-legitimate. But there's lots of people who will use fancy-sounding names, especially go to Japanese terminology, to describe things that there are entirely legitimate pre-existing words. Instead of armbar, we'll call it jujigatame, which is the Japanese term. For the last 40 years, we've been calling it armbar. So then I mean, it's not a revolutionary theory, but it is a marker of, I think it helps create in-group and out-group. It may be more tied to the cultish thing that we discussed earlier.
Yeah, and like in the case of Eddie Bravo, I think, it would probably be more tied to his advocacy of, marijuana as a essential component to broadening your mindset for BJJ. It could be right, but it's still in the format of a revolutionary idea. I have one of his books in which
I think there's a 17 or 18 page introduction, and on the first page he thanks his mom. Thanks, Mom, for being a great mom. Then he disses his dad, like, fuck you, Dad, you're just a sperm donor. And then the next 16 pages are thanking marijuana. It's the most interesting introduction to any book I have ever read. I'll say that.
Yeah,
it's on that shelf somewhere.
He's an interesting character, and somebody who has never met a conspiracy theory he wasn't interested in.
Instantly interested in. And I think that certainly if you could identify there's a high percentage of conspiracy thinking among 10th Planet guys. It's higher than the average. I'm not saying every 10th Planet guy is a conspiracy guy, but it's very definitely a correlation. So now, having alienated all of my audience, let's move on to point 8, pseudo-profound bullshit. I think when you publish this as your what did you call it? Pseudo-profound bullshit in the paper that you did publish on it?
We haven't published yet, but we'll be fine using that term because that's already appeared in the literature. That's not our term. That's an existing academic terminology. So, which I'm quite content with it existing because I think it accurately describes the feature that it tries to pick out.
Okay. I'm glad to see that scientific journals are willing to incorporate, rigorously defined terms in common usage. When I've listened to you guys talk, you've picked out Deepak Chopra, who I'm amazed we haven't got to before this point. With, I've got a quote here from one of your podcasts. There are no extra pieces in the universe. Everyone is here because he or she has a place to fill, and every piece must fit itself into the big jigsaw puzzle, which is completely disprovable. I think, how can you prove or disprove anything about that?
Yeah, and I think it also, the thing which makes it pseudo-profound is it sounds like it's saying something meaningful, but like if you kind of break it down, it's a very like mundane insight. Like we all exist in the universe, sure.
Yeah. I am not where you are right now. Yeah. We are talking by Zoom. We are not occupying the same physical space.
And this is a feature which in the Gurus I'm almost constantly impressed by, is their ability to use metaphorical language or analogies to stretch out a completely mundane point to fill like 10 minutes of content. And it often, like, it's kind of a great linguistic trick because it has all the appearances of something scientifically interesting or philosophically profound, but it's actually empty calories. Like, I'm sorry to go back to the Jordan Peterson well, but I thought this was like a really nice example once because he gave this extended example where he talked about he was basically wanting to talk about the profundity of religious art, Christian art in particular, and he talked about this painting of the Virgin Mary that was hung in a museum, and he started explaining that people would come from far and wide and that they weren't, even if they weren't religious, that they were just attracted to this image, and that illustrates that on some fundamental level, there's something deeply profound in this, meta myth of that's in Christianity. And like I was listening to it going, and he talked about it for maybe in total about 6 or 7 minutes, but like, there's lots of things in museums, right? there's a telephone with a lobster on top of it, and there's a shade of grey in the Tate Modern that people come from all over, and like, is that really saying there's something, deeply profound, or just that, people go to museums and view art and yeah, like, or
people have semi-religious experiences looking at a Van Gogh.
Yeah.
So, or an Andy Warhol, a picture of a can of I don't know how they do it, but I am reliably informed that by looking at a picture of a bunch of tomato cans, that they're tomato soup cans, that they are moved.
Yeah, and there are other people who use, physics metaphors and talk about superimposition and stuff when they really just want to say people can have multiple ideas, but they'll spend like 5 minutes on the physics before they get to that mundane point. So yeah, pseudo-profound bullshit is, I think it's wrapped in with also facility with the use of metaphor, because they serve one another. And again, with all these things, it can be used for legitimate purposes. A good metaphor or a good illustration of a point is really helpful sometimes. So it's more the issue when it's like coupled with empty calories of insight that make it a problem.
When we're talking about this, I'm thinking back to, I don't know, maybe the 90s, when it was really, really, really popular to write books talking about quantum physics and kind of metaphysical interpretations of quantum physics, or meditation and quantum physics. And then occasionally they'd work in the Mandelbrot set as well.
Yeah.
But and then it seems to have gone out of style.
That particular thing has slightly gone out of style, right? But it's just morphed into a new realm, because I completely agree. I think that's a precursor, or maybe just another manifestation, Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance belongs in that genre as well. Like, reference to you can go completely outside of physics and go to references to Zen and mysticism were popular in the 90s, I think, and maybe less so now. But like, if you look at Russel Brand's content, you'll get all of that. Yeah,
I try not to.
But you'll get all of that mixed in with voter ballot conspiracies and ivermectin promotion. Like, it's that's the thing which I think has somewhat, I don't know if it's changed, because like conspiracy communities have had political elements to them, but it's definitely that there's become a rather like transparent intertwining of the political and the conspiracy spheres, which is concerning.
Yeah, and somewhat newer.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's happened. I'm sure they're historical. Well, I don't want to go to Godwin's law of in every conversation going to invoke the Nazis, but certainly the rise of Hitler in the 1930s was heavily tied in with a massive conspiracy theory, the stab in the back theory, right? We had the Allies on the ropes. We were winning in 1917. We were going to finish them off in 1918. And then the Jews and the commies at home brought us down. And so that, arguably, the rise of Hitler, the Nazis, the Third Reich, and the Second World War are direct descendants of conspiracy thinking.
Yeah. And
which is taking us to our ninth point here of conspiracy mongering, which has kind of been the subtext of this whole conversation, because it's driving me fucking crazy.
Look, and I also gotta say that, that point you made about the Nazis is great, because it illustrates that, these stuff that we're looking at, okay, we're looking at the modern manifestation, but it's been with us a long time, and it will be here a long time after you and I are dead. So it's depressing in that state, but I think it's this perennial aspect of like humanity, just because of the way our brains are organized and the way we function in communities, that we have to grapple with, because it's always going to be there. And, with the Nazis as well, just to like put a bow on it, they also exploited these kind of mystical, legendary motifs, right? They were heavily into the whole concept about the Aryan race and various pseudosciences and pseudo histories attached to that. So these things do travel together, even outside the modern era, I guess.
Yeah. Well, while we're just wrapping up pseudoscientific bullshit, I would, to go back to an earlier point that I made, yes, if you want to talk about quantum physics, go ahead, but you better be doing research in quantum physics, and that means that your mathematics had better be off the chart. I don't know if Deepak Chopra, whether he's got the equivalent of postdoctoral. I don't even know the mathematics you would need to figure out quantum physics, but I guarantee that they're higher than what Deepak Chopra has. Yeah. So now you're just profounding upon somebody else's interpretation, and if you want to talk about it, great. But
I even think you have to be careful with the physicists who have genuine expertise in quantum physics because their speculation is going to be better informed on the physics side. But when they start ranging into consciousness and the nature of like free will and whatnot, you should at least be, have your critical thinking hat on. But there's no harm reading Roger Penrose's thoughts on consciousness and stuff, but just don't assume because he's a quantum physicist that he was right.
Well, how about necessary but not sufficient? Can we agree on that?
Yeah. So, because I think in some sense, people get upset when we are criticizing gurus that they like, but the message of our podcast, if there is a general one, is that these figures exist everywhere, and the characteristics that we are talking about, everybody's susceptible to. Or the techniques of manipulation work to some extent on everyone. So these are all things that you have to be aware of, even if you're not, in on chemtrails and following QAnon and talking about photo ballot conspiracies or anti-vax stuff. We're all prone to these being manipulated by people using these kind of techniques. So it's just important to recognize that it isn't about everyone else being dum-dums. It's that we're all dum-dums in some respects.
Yeah. Your last point on the Gurometer is grift, or what did you rename it as?
Profiteering.
So, can you give some examples? I mean, obviously, there's now, even if you monetize your YouTube videos and use them to drive speaking engagements, you don't actually need to be selling anything, or to turn it into a regular speaking position on Fox News. There, I'm betraying my liberal bias.
Look, I think there's an important point to this, which is everybody that is in the public eye to some extent or is producing content is likely to extract some benefit from it, right? Lots of content creators in this Web 2.0 space, including us, have Patreons, or produce books and market their insights, right? And this is normal. This is what people do. That people who want to produce content, they want to get some benefit from doing it. So our criticism is not, or this characteristic is not focused on that, because that's a normal thing. And the reason we wanted to name it profiteering is because it's talking about above and beyond that. Like the shilling of supplements is a good example. And this can take you'll often find somewhat bizarrely that in the podcast of gurus, there's this massive segment of it which is geared up towards promoting supplements or various courses or whatnot, and it's to an extent which is often surprising how much of the content it takes up. And then when you look into it, you'll also find that there tends to be various programs that involve, for example, paying a couple of $100 a month and you're able to attend an online lecture with the guru figure, or have some personal interaction with them. And like I say, there's always a spectrum where there's legitimate stuff, right? People pay for private lessons in martial arts, but there is I think everyone, even in martial arts, can tell the difference between when that's a source of income and, you're giving someone value, and when it veers into a kind of cultish dynamic where there's a personality cult formed and the person is extracting like thousands of dollars for a one-on-one meeting that lasts an hour or something like that, right? So in the martial arts space,
that's been done in the jiu-jitsu space for sure. And for some, there was like $1,000 an hour. If you want to learn leg locks, it's $1,300 an hour. If you want to learn self-defense leg locks, it was $2,000 an hour.
That better be some really good instruction.
Yeah.
It's with most of our characteristics, it's kind of the people taking it to an extreme that are concerned. But it isn't just people making profit from their content, because there's nothing wrong with that. Or whatever your stance on capitalism, maybe there is, but like, at least for us, there isn't anything wrong with people making money. It's more people exploiting like the fears of their audience to sell supplements or that kind of thing.
Okay. Well, this has gone way longer than I intended it to go. I really want to thank you for your being a good sport. And I know this is you probably have 1,000 things to do, it being a Monday in Japan. Tell people about the podcast. And I'm going to ask one more question. When you talk about the podcast, what do your academic colleagues think about you doing this podcast? Or is podcasting becoming more the norm in academia than it was when I was in that world?
Okay. So maybe I'll answer the first bit and then I'll tell people where they can find the podcast if they're interested. And I appreciate your indulging. As you can probably gather from the length of our podcast, I don't have any problem talking. It's unfortunate. Maybe I'll blame it on Northern Irish culture. It's not me, it's them. But yeah, so in regards to how do my academic colleagues regard it, in large part, with indifference or lack of awareness, and because it is, so those who are aware of it are generally positive about it, but it tends to be the earlier career people who are interested in academics, and in that case they get what podcasts are and often have some experience or interest in the area. But I think that in my case, because in some sense it dovetails with the interests I have about the psychology of groups and the religious belief and ritual psychology, there are elements where it crosses over, and I have the optimistic view that I'll be able to kind of combine my academic interests to this topic and make use of all the stuff that we're doing for the podcast as well. But so it isn't regarded in any case as a negative thing, except, whereas maybe people are like, how much time does it take to do? But I do it all in my spare time. So it's...
Well, I think it's really important because the number of people who will read your academic... arguably what you publish in some journal reaches much deeper into a very small group of people. But the stuff that you do on the Decoding the Gurus reaches a much broader audience. And I think... given that I approve of your message, given that I think you're right, given that I think you're on the correct side of history, I think it's really important, and to some extent helps counteract the giant waves of bullshit that are out there. In a way that publishing yet another paper or presenting at yet another conference, that's important too. I don't mean to diminish it, but it's a little bit ivory tower.
Look, I completely agree, and I think it's entirely valid to diminish the rituals in academia for what they are. Like, I agree, it's important to publish things in the literature and kind of do the academic rigor thing, which is necessary if you want to produce an academic work on the topic. But I'm under no illusion that the material that I would produce in an academic setting will be seen by as many people that the podcast would, and we're doing well according to metrics as far as I know, but even best cited papers would pale in comparison to the kinds of people that they would reach. So I definitely think there's value to producing content like what we do and what you do as well, and so I kind of regard it as my academic work is interested in getting at the uncovering truth such as it exists, or I try to do research and do empirical studies into topics, but I've always been interested in kind of skepticism and science and scientific method. And I think looking at gurus in the lens that we do is just applying some of the insights that I've got from my academic background to a topic in a way that people can understand. And hopefully, we have fun doing it as well. So we're not always potheist serious. But yeah, so I hope there is value to it, and I think there is, even if people 100%. Don't agree with me about the lab leak.
Well, that's enough foreplay. What is your podcast, Chris, and how do I follow it?
Yeah, so the podcast is Decoding the Gurus, which can be found in all good podcast apps and whatnot. And then the Twitter account for it is Gurus Pod. If you use Twitter, and God help you if you do. But and we have a small but relatively lively Reddit, which has some interesting discussion on it. So those are the places you can follow. Like, if you want to follow me personally, I'm C_Kavanagh on Twitter. I can only manage one social network at a time. And Matt is Arthur C. Dent at Twitter from Hitchhiker fame. So yeah, you can find us there. We have, I guess we have about 20 or with interview episodes out now. So there's a long back catalogue if anybody's interested.
Yeah. Well, I can't recommend it highly enough, and I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day. Good luck with what you're doing, Chris, and I wish you good fortune in the wars to come.
Yeah, same to you. It's been a pleasure, Stephan, and I finally can repay you for watching your instructional videos in BJJ all those years ago. To a small extent, they were very helpful.
We'll wipe the debt clean. Take care, my friend.
Thanks very much.